Our sponsor this evening is the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. I am presently the vice president of the board. The organization has existed since 1966. We are about we are all called to be priests of our church, to bring about transformation in the church and also society. So we welcome you this evening. Our topic is the Catholic call to work to end white supremacy.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Gwendolyn, and good evening to everyone tuning in from wherever you might all be tuning in from, even if most of you might be in Pittsburgh. I'm so grateful to be in community with you all today, and thank you so much for allowing me to be with you via Zoom this evening. I know the early stages of this, we were hoping it would be in person, so I'm grateful that I'm able to be in community with you via Zoom. And before I begin, I just want to thank Sister Barbara and everyone involved in inviting me to speak today as part of the 2022 Spring Speaker Series of the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. Today I will be talking about my work, excuse me. Today I will be talking about my work and my faith journey and how both are informed by the abolitionist organizers and thinkers that I have covered for 10 years in Catholic media. I hope that what you hear today allows you to think more deeply about the culture, the world into which we are all born, and how both are shaped by white supremacist violence, and how this violence in turn impacts how we relate to the people around us. Our Catholic faith demands that we acknowledge white supremacy and the role Christianity has played in sustaining it. By acknowledging this relationship and by further understanding how imperialism and colonialism have shaped our world, we can begin to transform our church, our country, and our world. And this is especially important at this moment in history. We are seeing violence against Black and brown migrants all across the world, from our US borders to Ukraine, to Yemen, to Palestine. We are seeing violence against our queer and transgender sisters and brothers. We are seeing violence against houseless women, men, and children. We are seeing violence against incarcerated people, violence against refugees and migrants. Our Catholic faith demands that we name these various tragedies and harms and work to eliminate oppressive systems that destroy our world's most marginalized, the very systems that led to the crises we are seeing worldwide. For me, in order to understand what it means to be a Catholic at this moment in history, in order to understand what it means to do this work, and in order to understand the role that our faith plays in this, and in order to, most importantly, maintain the hope and courage to do this work, for me, that begins with understanding abolition. Abolition Feminism Now is a book by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica R. Miners, and Beth E. Ritchie. In this book, they write that abolition is both a mode of analysis and a political practice. They add, abolition feminism has always been a politics, the refusal to co-sign humans and other beings to disposability, inseparable from practice. This means acknowledging and sitting with history, especially the histories of freedom fighting and organizing, the histories and stories that are kept out of our churches, our schools, and our media. Once we sit with and understand this history, we must then allow it to challenge how we think about our church and our faith, and how we imagine, fight for, and build a freer, more authentic, and equitable world. For me, some of the questions I'm sitting with at this moment, especially as I try to grapple with what it means to think about abolition as a Catholic and what it means to help people think about what it means to engage with these topics as Catholics, I sit with questions like these. How can one use an abolitionist framework to think more critically about our faith? How can such a framework allow Catholics to build hope amid so much collective death? And how can this framework, an abolitionist framework, challenge us as Catholics, as believers of Christ who are called to respond at this moment in our church and nation's history? I have been sitting with many of these questions as I prepared for my talk today. These questions and what it means to think about abolitionist Catholics continue to be at the heart of my own work and commitment to justice, resistance, and liberation. Like many of you on the Zoom today, I began to fully think about these questions more deeply for the first time in my life after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has killed more than 900,000 Americans, and in New York, my hometown, more than 60,000 people have lost their lives. Thousands have lost health insurance, jobs, savings, and their homes. It has disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, communities which still continue to face violence at the hands of armed police officers. As I was processing all of these various tragedies, while also working on birth of a movement, my father got COVID. My partner's father got COVID. Many of our friends lost relatives, jobs. And amid all that, cops were still shooting Black Americans. Violence against trans women and men was still rising. I began to sit with what it means to exist and survive in a state of constant anxiety. How that anxiety becomes a constant state of surveillance. How that constant state of self-surveillance, already compounded by state violence and surveillance, impacts every part of your life, including your relationship to God. I wrote my first book in that space. I wrote the first draft of a manuscript and sent it off to my publisher sometime in the summer of 2020. By August, I rarely left my home, and I worried whenever my partner left our apartment. Slowly, I learned that anxiety was also physical. For months at a time, I couldn't walk without back, shoulder, or chest pain, and I rarely ate without a subsequent wave of nausea. Anxiety was a part of my vocation, my ministry. You wrote your first book in that space, I told myself, so I continued to find new ways to fuel it, to justify it. And those are some of the darkest months of the pandemic for me. My faith suffered immensely because I could not find hope in the world around me. I finally understood just how cruel the US systems of oppression were, here and worldwide, and I couldn't imagine a better world. Amid so much collective death, I really struggled to find hope. I struggled to pray, and I struggled to believe. I did not really emerge from that space until I attended the Black Catholic Theological Symposium in the fall of 2021. The gathering, which took place at Notre Dame, included Black scholars, theologians, and clergy. And it was here where I met Dr. Valerie D. Lewis Mosley, a brilliant pastoral theologian, activist, and professor at Caldwell University. If you aren't familiar with her work, I recommend you go and read her essay, My Unbridled Tongue Challenges Inequities That Threaten Black Women's Lives, which she wrote for the National Catholic Reporter in July of 2020. During my time at Notre Dame, I listened to Valerie mentor younger activists, including high school and college students. She reminded them of the importance of caring for one's body. She emphasized the need to bring our healthy, whole selves to whatever advocacy work we do as Catholics. This was health rooted in loving and caring for oneself. She described the love and hope in Jesus' ministry, the power and love of Christ on the cross, and she challenged me. She helped me to begin to understand that an abolitionist framework, if applied to our daily lives, demanded that we imagine and hope for and strive outside of the tragedies around us, and not by further breaking ourselves, but by relying on our communities. Community building was a way to build and create systems outside of the ones around us, systems outside of the violence of our world. It took me months to fully realize how pivotal that moment was for my own faith life. Valerie inspired me and revitalized my commitment to my own vocation, to my faith, to liberation. I witnessed an intergenerational moment in which she shared her wisdom with someone younger than us both that reminded me of the power of sharing knowledge, the power of telling stories, the power of being in community, the power of dreaming and building, the power of abolitionist practice in my faith and life. She pointed me back to why I began reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, why I wrote the book in 2020, why I write and speak about it today. It was a movement that taught an entire generation how to fight for liberation grounded in the hope of a better world. It was a movement that taught my generation how to imagine, how to fight for, and how to build a world that refuses to co-sign humans and other beings to disposability. In 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the killing of Trayvon Martin, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created the Black Lives Matter movement. At the time, it was mostly an online campaign on Twitter and Facebook to help empower organizers, especially younger ones, by providing them with the tools and resources to think about and fight for racial justice. The founders, in the summer of 2014, along with more than 400 organizers from all across the United States, traveled to Ferguson, Missouri. This was shortly after Michael Brown Jr. was killed. These organizers, a majority of whom were women and men in the LGBTQ community, helped to support the marchers who were facing daily violence from law enforcement. Since its birth almost 10 years ago, the movement has grown to include chapters all across the country, providing resources on restorative justice, abolition, and conflict resolution. It is a movement centered around inclusion, affirming and centering the experiences of Black, queer, and trans women and men, and working toward a world where all Black people are liberated and free, and by extension, all people. One moment. The Black Lives Matter movement taught me how to respond to the world around me. It taught me to pay attention to the most marginalized voices in our nation, how to uplift these voices while also learning from them. By teaching me how to uplift marginalized voices, I began to learn how white supremacy conditions us to erase these experiences, how it disempowers Blackness. I began to understand how patriarchal white power moves every institution in America, including our church. I was learning about privilege while also coming of age on Twitter. I was existing in spaces where I was accepting my own Blackness, while also understanding how this same oppressed body was privileged. How this privilege allows me to move in spaces and with power not afforded to darker-skinned women. Through the online hashtag, I was introduced to social critics outside of the movement, who embodied the tenets of the founders and who helped me to think more deeply about why and how this movement was born. This included thinkers like Zahida Kelly, Zoe Zadmudzi, Dwayne David Paul, and William C. Anderson. Like the founders and organizers of the Black Lives Matter movement, these thinkers were using social media to help their followers think more deeply about Blackness, abolition, sexuality, colorism, and capitalism. The more I internalized the mission of these women and the organizers around the movement, the more I began to challenge the whiteness of American Catholicism, both internally and externally. In 2014 and 2015, I started attending protests and interviewing activists. I began talking with other Black Catholics, other Catholics of color, about what this movement meant and how it could challenge our church's leadership to commit itself more fully to liberation work. We talked about the role this movement was playing and how we understood and responded to the signs of the times, how this movement challenged our conscientiousness and our relationship to Catholicism. I was born in the Dominican Republic, a Black Catholic country in the Caribbean that shares land with another Black Catholic country, Haiti. Yet I did not acknowledge my own Black Catholic identity until my mid-20s, when I began reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. It took me years to unlearn and begin to truly understand my own Black immigrant Catholic identity, one that was extremely privileged and also oppressed. This movement helped me to begin asking questions internally, while also presenting how these questions and themes were shaping the stories I was writing. Black Lives Matter and other current social justice movements and organizations like the Sunrise Movement and the Dream Defenders are teaching Americans, especially millennials and younger, how to organize, how to talk about oppression, how to be in solidarity at a time of social distancing and limited in-person contact. It helped me begin to decolonize my Christianity, to begin to imagine my life outside of the colonialist violence that introduced the faith to my homeland. Most importantly, it helped me learn how to center voices who didn't get a platform in our church and in media. And all of this conscientiousness altered my faith and my relationship to our church. These movements taught me how to be Catholic, how to be a Catholic writer, how to live out what Pope Francis was preaching. I like to say that along with coming of age on Twitter, I also came of age during the papacy of Pope Francis. Together with the Black Lives Matter movement, he has challenged me to understand how consumerism under capitalism and systemic oppression are related, how both intersect with white supremacy and vice versa. Pope Francis consistently calls on us to, and I quote, to get to know people, listen, expand the circle of ideas, end quote. Being open to the ways God is moving us and calling us to respond to the world around us means that we are, Francis preaches, to find, and I quote, the courage to leave the confines of our own security and comfort, to become bruised, hurting, and dirty as we joyfully approach the suffering other in a spirit of solidarity. For white people committed to authentic, radical anti-racism work, solidarity must include dialogue around power. Who has it? Who does not? This means acknowledging and working to relinquish this power. This means recognizing and thinking and talking about white privilege, how white supremacy and racial capitalism have benefited them while simultaneously exploiting and killing communities of color, and how these privileges are present in daily, seemingly mundane interactions. This work will be both internal and external, and it is not easy, but it is absolutely necessary. White allies and all privileged allies, including myself, must sit with the reality that if you truly care about solidarity, if you truly care about Black lives, about creating a more inclusive church and nation, about faith-based advocacy, then it means asking ourselves, what am I willing to give up to truly center and uplift marginalized women, children, and men? What does it mean to critique not just oppressive systems, but the power and privileges white bodies are allowed to hold in America? How can one use an abolitionist framework to think more critically about these systems? Being concerned with anti-racism work for me as a Black immigrant Catholic means being concerned with anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist work. It means embracing and applying an abolitionist feminist framework to my work. I believe that this means, as Francis teaches us, that instead of centering our own wants, our own well-being, and our own needs above those of the community, we have to reject the very systems that created our throwaway society and work to create a world built around a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has remained silent, collectively, while individual bishops and leaders have opined on this movement. Currently, there is no collective guidance from our leaders on how to engage with Black Lives Matter or any current social justice movement outside of the church, especially those organized by younger people. Yet despite the lack of pastoral leadership from the institutional American church, we continue to see Catholics who are showing up to the challenges of working toward justice and liberation. We have seen Black and brown Catholics doing liberation work in the church since its birth. We know there were Black and brown Catholics present in Ferguson in 2014. And we know that Catholics of color, and many white Catholics, protested in a variety of different ways all across the country following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others killed in recent years. I interviewed Catholics who were present in Missouri in 2014. And I've talked to Catholics who have marched in protest in their respective cities following the murder of George Floyd. In recent years, we have seen white Catholics engaging with the movement, and many were actively and consistently raising funds for organizers and mutual aid campaigns. Many were also using their various platforms to urge fellow white Catholics to support people of color being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. One second. Many hosted Zoom book clubs and webinars where they discussed many of the topics and themes I've mentioned here tonight. Many listened and learned from women and men of color. All of these efforts are important and they must continue. But they are not enough, and white Catholics, both lay and clergy, cannot get complacent. We must continue to confront our history. We must understand how we as a church have been shaped by the very colonialist sentiments that guided the early church and the so-called founders of this country. How those sentiments connect to the white rage and violence we saw at the Capitol, and how that anger and hate relates to the inability of our church leaders to collectively engage with any movement that is not led by white men. The United States has always encouraged white rage and violence. European colonizers, angered by the treatment they received in their homelands, arrived on Turtle Island and violently stormed and pillaged lands that were not theirs. Colonizers raped and murdered and profited from this violence, selling enslaved African women, men, and children. The creation of new technology at the turn of the 20th century meant more reformed, sanitized systemic violence against citizens of color. Segregation, voting restrictions, redlining, prisons, detention centers. The United States of America has the highest number of incarcerated people, and our inequitable healthcare system has contributed to the deaths of almost 1 million Americans. Such white colonialist violence is how my people became Catholic. This is Catholic history, a part of our faith that cannot be ignored. There can be no reckoning and no path forward for our church until our leaders and all white Catholics begin to repair the harm our church has caused and continues to cause Catholics of color. This means sitting with this history and allowing it to change and better your relationship to your faith, your relationship to your community, to the world around you. I want to challenge white people inside and outside of our church to engage with abolitionist work, including organizers and thinkers who are inviting us to learn from the multiple ways ordinary people try to respond to interpersonal harm, particularly gender and sexual violence, without resorting to police and prisons. This must frame the way white Catholics are thinking about allyship, because it can challenge white people inside and outside of the church to internalize and learn about the power that they can shift to other communities. I want white Catholics to confront their privilege and think about how they have been complicit in systemic oppression. And I want this to inform how you relate and uplift the pro-life issues that matter to Black, Indigenous, POC communities. Black and Latinx citizens continue to be disproportionately affected by this violence, especially during the pandemic. Women of color make up the majority of unemployment rates. Black mothers continue to receive inadequate medical care, from primary care physicians denying their pain to higher maternal mortality rates. Indigenous teens face the highest rates of suicide rates and domestic abuse. Asian American women are most likely to remain unemployed longer than 6 months. And the Asian community continues to be harassed and assaulted by racists all across the country. US Black and Latinx trans women are 3 times more likely to be killed. Americans of color also face higher rates of anxiety, depression, and are more likely to suffer a heart attack or stroke. I'm sharing these statistics today because white people in our church need to hear them and understand that along with the various tragedies threatening our livelihood, we are also suffering anxiety, depression, We are spiritually devastated. We are spiritually suffering. And this is violence every single day enacted upon our communities, enacted upon our lives. Despite this violence, I find hope in the resilience and wisdom of Black people, of women like Valerie, who continue to spread intergenerational wisdom, who inspire and call us to action. For white allies, resilient hope must include uplifting all of our stories, all of our pains, all of our hopes. But it also means sitting with colonialist history and the church's historic complicity in systemic oppression. In sitting with this history, you must sit with the feelings and question it raises. It is in this space where resilient hope can be born, where true, authentic liberation work for white allies must be grounded. To fight for Christ-centered liberation, one founded in love, one founded in hope, this means that we must fight to free communities like mine from any kind of suffering. As Davis, Dent, Miners, and Ritchie wrote in Abolition Feminism Now, abolition will not end all harm or interpersonal violence. We must do the work to both prevent and reduce harm, while we practice and grow transformative ways to respond when harm does happen. Abolition feminism is this intentional investment of our resources to support a flourishing of our collective best selves, while reclaiming accountability from the carceral regime. For Catholics, this can mean thinking more deeply about the resources and groups created at our respective parish groups, on Catholic campuses, in Catholic book clubs. This means asking what relationships our physical churches, parishes, and religious groups have to oppressive systems, including local police forces. This means creating and imagining new ways to be Catholic allies. Excuse me. Whether this allyship means raising funds for bailouts or supporting organizers after they are arrested at protests, or whether this means supporting organizers who are struggling to feed themselves or who are struggling to pay their rent. This allyship can take its form in supporting whatever these communities might need in the short term and the long term as well. And this is especially important for queer and trans women who often are at the center of these grassroots movements and who are doing a lot of this work as unpaid labor. Most importantly, applying an abolitionist lens and thinking about what it means to be abolitionists as Catholics means dreaming. It means seeing the violence around us. It means seeing the oppression around us, seeing the tragedy, the pain, the suffering that is happening around us, and knowing that our belief in Christ allows us to believe in a better world. Our belief in Christ allows us to fight for a world where every single person is treated with the human dignity that they deserve. Abolition is rooted in hope, and hope is something that is familiar for us, and abolition can help us to think about what it means to be hopeful as Catholics in a world where it can be very difficult to be hopeful, in a world and at a time where it is very dark right now. It is very, very sad, and sometimes that sadness and tragedy can feel overwhelming. But for me, grounding my faith in trying to understand what it means to create outside of these systems allows me to return to what's at the heart of the gospel. And at the heart of the gospel is building a world where every person has value, a world where every person is treated with their God-given dignity. And for me, abolition work is Christ-centered work. It is meeting the people, the community that is in front of you, meeting the people and the needs that they need to survive that are in front of you. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you all with a quote that helped me to prepare for today's dialogue, and which has set the theme for my work, my prayer life these last few months. And especially I'm currently working on a book review that will be out in the next month or so that tries to think about what it means to be a millennial Catholic who is trying to apply an abolitionist lens to her work. And a lot of the time that I spent engaging in this research and trying to figure out how to talk about this, a lot of the time it is easier for me to envision and to dream and center myself in the hope of abolition using fiction. Fiction allows me, in all art, I do a lot of cultural work at NCR, so I'm very into finding God in books, movies, TV, etc. And fiction is a genre that allows me to dream and envision and find hope when it can be, again, very difficult to do that around us. So I want to leave you with this quote that is a part of a set called Harvest of Survival, an affirmation deck inspired by Octavia Butler. This was a gift that my sister gave me and my partner earlier this year. And each card features a quote from Parable of the Sower or Parable of the Talents. And each card also has a question for the reader to reflect on. And the affirmation card I didn't draw this card today. I drew it a few weeks ago, but I've been sitting with it since I drew it. And it is a quote, the one that I drew includes a quote from Parable of the Talents that reads, "To shape God with wisdom and forethought, to benefit your world, your people, your life, consider consequences, minimize harm, ask questions, seek answers, learn, teach." And toward the end of the card, the questions read, "How are you protecting and supporting your life, your people, and your world?" I hope I helped you all reflect on what it means to support your people, what it means to support your church, and what it means to support the world around you. Thank you.
Oh, I wondered if you would expand a little bit about intersectionality. I've learned that in my own journey, that it's not just a singular issue or response, but there's many things that come together. So could you expound a little bit on that?
Yes, totally. Give me 1 second. My computer's running a little slow, so I'm just trying to close off these screens so it doesn't shut me down on Zoom.
Yeah.
So I won't use the word for word definition, but if you want the full definition, it was a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectionality is the concept that says that every part of who we are as lived people impacts how the world treats us and impacts how we are allowed to relate to the world around us. So for example, for me, I am a Black Catholic immigrant from the Dominican Republic. So those are all of the intersectionalities of who I am, and that impacts how the world perceives me as a marginalized person in this group. However, for a darker skinned woman who is also from the Dominican Republic or from Haiti, who is also an immigrant and who comes to the United States, because of her skin color, because of the racialized elements of skin in this country, that her experience and the oppression she faces is different from the oppression and lived experiences that I might face. So intersectionality really challenges us to take into account every single part of a person's identity, whether that is how they identify with their gender, how they identify sexually, how they identify ethnically, racially, whatever identity they might identify as, or however they might, whatever aspects of their identity they might include, that shapes how the world treats them and that shapes how they relate to the world. And so when we are talking about, let's say, for example, what it means when we're talking about the wage gap in the United States, right? We're talking about how men make more than women. Well, when we're talking about that, the general stats that we see, we're talking about men making more money than white women. And then that number is significantly lower for Black women. It is lower for Latinx women. It is lower for Asian women. And intersectionality invites us to ask why that is, why it is that a darker skinned immigrant woman will make less in the same space that a white woman will. So intersectionality really requires us to take into account the full authentic wholeness of how a person identifies and how they are viewed.
Great. Thanks so much, Olga. And also, could you say a little bit about what do you feel would be good first steps for anyone to be good allies of one another? How do we begin that process within ourselves?
Within ourselves? I think a good way to think about this allyship more deeply, I think really, and then this is going to sound really, really repetitive, but I am using my own experience here, as I often do. I think that begins with confronting this history, right? It begins with confronting how the United States really became the United States, for example. I think allyship can begin with different types of topics or research areas, et cetera. But I think that begins with confronting how these stories and histories we are told about what it means to be a people in America, what it means to be a church in America, have always been framed by white men and women. And so if those stories have been shaped by a very particular demographic, then that means that other experiences have been left out. Other stories, other types of oppression have been left out. So allyship for me, especially for white folks, begins with sitting with this history and acknowledging that because of whiteness, certain folks in this country and all across the world have been able to have privileges, whether that has been perpetuated through legal policies in the United States, through the help of our government, our churches, whatever. White bodies have been allowed to exist with a level of safety and comfort that has not been afforded to other marginalized folks. And to understand why that is, we need to sit with history, and we need to understand how this country was formed, how every institution in this country was formed. Because one of the issues that I often encounter when I have conversations with people who are really struggling to do this allyship, to do this kind of authentic allyship, is that they don't understand this history. And if you don't understand this history, then you won't understand just how insidious oppression actually is, how it is rooted into every single interaction in our daily lives. So I think allyship has to begin with that history, and has to begin with, once you sit with that history, and once you sit with the discomfort, and once you acknowledge the privilege that your own respective body has been allowed to experience, then I think that begins the internal shift, right? Then I think that begins to do the changing of heart that Pope Francis does, right? And I think that has to happen with sitting with this history and being able to see that there is evidence to all of this. There is evidence to how these systems have been oppressive since the days of chattel slavery in this country. And I think allyship begins with that. And then once you are sitting with that, once you are being changed with that, then you also have to start actively thinking about what that can look like in the short term and the long term, right? And I think it could be something as simple as hosting events like this, where people can have a space to talk about these things authentically, right? Because I also want to acknowledge that it is not easy. It's not easy to say, oh, wow, everything I understand about this country, everything I understand about this church is not the full picture. It is not how I have understood all of these institutions to be. And that can be very scary. And I know for me, once I fully understood just how systemic racism and white supremacy are in virtually every institution in the United States, it was very difficult for me, because it's so much easier to believe that these systems are good, that these systems are perfect. It's so much easier to believe that than to be challenged to change. And I think allyship has to have the acknowledgement, the study and research, and then that has to shape how you then interact in your everyday life, right? Whether you want to dedicate your life to raising funds for any given cause, or if you want to dedicate your life to protesting outside the Capitol, or writing and challenging bishops and other church leaders to be better. I think that part is fluid, that part can change, but the part that I think cannot is the work that has to be done by allies, especially white allies, to sit with this history and to acknowledge this history internally and externally and say, hey, I have been able to exist as a white person, as a privileged person, in a way that other marginalized folks have not been able to. So what can now, with that understanding, how can I begin to shift power? How can I begin to support the communities that need it? And also, what do these communities need, right? This also requires being in community with these spaces and asking these spaces, how can I contribute? How should I be contributing, right? And I think those are some of the ways that that allyship can work.
We had a couple people in the chat who wanted more information of what is meant by that abolitionist framework that you were talking about. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so abolitionists.
Oh, just for one second. There's another question that's kind of related to it that you may handle them separately, but the one may help the other. What can we do in our everyday lives to be abolitionists? So, I mean, the practical might put a little more focus.
That's good. Thanks, Jim. Yeah,
thank you. So for me, and again, I want to be totally authentic and upfront. So these are still topics that I'm grappling with in real time and trying to reconcile with my faith. But for me, an abolitionist feminist framework means exactly what I quoted when I was talking. It means imagining and trying to build systems that exist outside of the current systems that we see that contribute to so much human suffering. And this framework is built around the idea that no human being is undeserving of dignity, that no human being is undeserving of the space and resources that they need to thrive and to build a better life. Now, that is very much a political ideology that can be discussed in one way, but more practically, for me, as a practice, that as a Catholic and who is trying to embody that kind of framework into her life, that means, okay, what does it mean in the work that I do as an editor? What does it mean in the work that I do when I step into my worship spaces every Sunday? What does it mean when I am organizing with people in the Bronx? And for me, this means that we talk about what is causing whatever harm we are working to fix, right? What system is playing an institutional role in perpetuating a system of violence? So for example, in New York City, I'm involved in a lot of conversations around the NYPD and the use of force by the NYPD in responding to domestic violence situations in New York City. So in a lot of the spaces I'm in, we think, okay, we don't want to call the police because we know that often calling the police can lead to unwanted violence that we do not want. So how can we build systems where if we know there are domestic violence situations happening in our respective buildings, how can we build a system where we can step in as mediators and we can say, okay, we see that this is going on. Let's separate this situation. Let's figure out the support that a man might need in that situation. Let's figure out the support that the woman might need in that situation or the children might need. How do we hold the party who is causing the injury responsible? How do we hold them accountable while also taking into account the needs of the person who is being harmed in this particular situation? And for me, in applying that to my daily life means acknowledging that we should be able to live in a world where we don't incarcerate human beings, whether that's at the border, whether it's in prisons, whether it's in jails, wherever. To believe that, then it means how do we actively build a society that addresses the reasons why people end up in these spaces, right? How do we create programs that support youth after school who might need support instead of falling victim to the school to prison pipeline system? What does it mean to create groups to support single mothers who need support? So that for me is what applying an abolitionist framework means. It means thinking actively as a Catholic how to build society outside of these violent accountability systems that have become the norm.
Thank you, Olga. Betty, I'll call you in a second. I see your hand, but we did have another in the chat. They wanted to know what is meant when you said Catholics of color. What is that?
Oh, Catholics of color. I mean, not all non-white Catholics. So Indigenous Catholics, Latinx Catholics, Asian Catholics. That's what I mean by Catholics of color.
Okay. And then there was a person that wanted to know, are you familiar with the Pew study on Black America that was created, and what your response might be to that?
Oh, yes, I am familiar with the parent study, so to speak, of faith among Black Americans that was released by Pew last year in 2021. And then the one this year that was, it was released yesterday, actually, which was specifically looking at Black Catholics in America. And I think that research, I'm very familiar with it because I'm Tia Noel Pratt, Dr. Tia Noel Pratt, who wrote the foreword to my book, was also very involved in the process with Pew. And I think that this research is unbelievably critical for our church. And it is, especially at a time when we are talking about what it means to do anti-racism work within our church, to see a study that centers the 3 million or so Black Catholics that exist in the United States, and to center stats like, Black Catholics are particularly concerned with pastors who talk about racism at the pulpit. These are extremely important. This is extremely important data for us to have, because the Black Catholic experience is so heavily left out of what it means to be Catholic in the United States. And the Catholic faith is so whitewashed, even as we know that the number of Latinx Catholics is growing in this country. The history of Catholicism is still so white. And both of these reports are extremely, extremely important in pushing our church to step outside of its whiteness. And I'm so grateful for Dr. Pratt and the research of all the other Catholics who are involved in this, because it is very, very important for our church. And if you haven't read it, I suggest that you do.
We all get copies of it. Great, thanks. We had one person that wanted to know whether you get a lot of pushback with your message.
I do. I get a lot of pushback because I get a lot of pushback because we know things like Black Lives Matter, abolition, defunding the police. These are things that have become very polarized in sort of the American zeitgeist and in our church. So I get a lot of pushback from people who just don't want to engage with that at all. And when I encounter that kind of pushback, it's, there's not much I can do with someone who doesn't want to be receptive or open to that. But the pushback that I like to sit with is when folks are just genuinely like, I don't understand what this means. I don't understand how this concept it should be intertwined with our faith. And that pushback for me feels less sort of antagonistic and more reflective of like, oh, people are trying to do this work. But like I said, it is very, very complicated and it is not easy. So I get pushback from people who just don't want to hear any women of color talking about anything. And then I get pushback from people who are just genuinely confused and who feel very overwhelmed. There's so much going on. We're still very much in a pandemic. And so sometimes the pushback comes from that place, from a place of fear rather than a place of, well, you just don't have a right to be here. And that I'm actually grateful for that pushback, because it allows me to think about how to make these things that can be very profound more accessible and welcoming for folks. So those are the two sort of pushbacks that I encounter when I talk about these topics.
Great, thanks, Olga. Betty Pickett, you're on.
Yeah, there are two things that I find just absolutely insidious, and that is implicit bias and microaggression. Could you please speak to those two?
Yes, thank you so much for raising those, Betty. So implicit bias, again, I'm not always going to offer a perfect definition, but implicit bias, the ways in which I have seen it manifest just in the white Catholic spaces that I've been a part of, implicit bias always sort of shows up when we are talking about expertise in Catholic spaces. A lot of the times when I am in predominantly white spaces and we're talking about, for example, a theologian who can talk about the sacraments, or a theologian who can talk about the bishops or Rome, whenever those conversations are had, it is always centered around, what it means to be a white expert. And the names that are always brought up are always, more often than not, white men. And for me, that is how implicit bias tends to manifest itself in a lot of the spaces I'm in. And it's with this understanding that if you embody any kind of marginalized body that is deemed unprofessional, then you are no longer worthy of being an expert. And that implicit bias, I encounter it a lot, especially when I am trying to introduce folks to younger Black and brown queer Catholic writers, that there's an implicit bias against these voices because they have not been centered and uplifted in Catholic spaces. They're often deemed unworthy or not as having much to offer. And that to me is a manifestation of implicit bias. And microaggressions, microaggressions just manifest. These are just the small instances of racism that don't feel as bad as, say, the prison industrial complex, but that are still harmful to people of color in day-to-day interactions. And for me, those microaggressions have ranged from, oh, wow, your hair is really, really wild, or your accent, it sounds a little different, or it sounds a little cute. And these are things that if you are having these conversations in your intimate personal spaces, they're not a problem. But when you are in predominantly white spaces and people are commenting on your body or commenting on your appearance, that is very much a microaggression, because it is a moment where you're trying to police someone's body in an open forum in which that policing shouldn't be happening. So those are the ways that I understand implicit bias and some microaggressions and see them manifest in my everyday interactions in Catholic media. I hope that answered your question, Betty.
Great.
And I think one of the things that we see in the church is, prior to the pandemic, when Black folks went to shake the hand of a white person, they would clasp their chest. And it was like, if I touch you, I might catch something. And or to deny your story. I think that was the biggest thing. When I did 12 years of Catholic school, and I've got stories. And so if I shared that, it was like, oh, that couldn't have happened. And so you deny my life. And so that I think is another way that we see the implicit bias or the microaggression, is just to deny it, that it doesn't exist to your face.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Betty, because you're absolutely right. There is a level of gaslighting that also happens in these spaces where you say, hey, I know this is a predominantly white space, and I know you're not used to working with Black or brown folks, but here's what I'm experiencing. Here's something that is actually racist, and you might not know. I've been in many situations where I say, hey, something that was said that, might have been nothing to you was actually harmful, and here's why it's harmful. And I have often been met with, well, that's not true. That's not how I saw it. That's not how I felt it. And that it took me a very long time to understand that, because it is so normal in Catholic spaces. That gaslighting is so normal that it actually took me working with Gen Z folks who were like, hey, by the way, I know that feels normal to you, but this is what this is. So a lot of that, for me, that gaslighting is actually one of the most harmful ways that you see it. And you actually believe it, right? Because that's what happens with racial gaslighting, right? You believe the fact that your lived experience is being denied by someone, and you say, oh, okay, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe I'm overreacting, when in reality, it is just gaslighting. It is another form of racial violence that happens in everyday life.
Gwen, I see you, but just a minute. We have a couple in the chat that got in there. Jim,
Barb,
the one about
I was going to do the one, Holly's. First of all, thank you. You inspire and challenge so many of us. I'm wondering how you would suggest we approach decolorizing the Catholic Church, as we live within a hierarchical, patriarchal Catholic Church structure, especially if we work and live with it, closely within the institution. You're involved with America, so I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's, you're in it, and not in it?
Yeah, I think a lot of that colorizing work, a lot of that sort of dismantling of the patriarchy that we see in a lot of our Catholic spaces, I think a lot of that has already started happening at the very grassroots level. And I've noticed that in particular because of the pandemic, right? We have had to be forced into isolation, and we have been removed from our very physical church spaces, right? Even this event was supposed to be in person, but COVID sort of threw that off. And throughout the pandemic, I have seen people who are building the church that they wish to see, and I'm not talking in sort of institutional work with the hierarchy in and of itself, but I'm talking more of an intimate grassroots way of being church that is more intimate, but also has a sense of urgency that a lot of us are not finding in the institutional church. And I think that it is in those spaces, in a lot of those grassroots spaces, in a lot of spaces like these, right, where it's just 60 plus Catholics gathered and trying to figure out how to build and do liberation work. In a lot of these grassroots spaces, I think that work of dismantling the patriarchal power of the church is already happening. I think this might have been a comment that I heard Sister Barbara mention before the event started, or at the start of the event, I can't remember, but like the idea of building, not just relying on the bishops and not just relying on these leaders to be the example and model that we want the church to be. And I think people are doing that. I think people are saying, hey, if our leaders are not being the pastors that we need them to be publicly, then we're just going to do that in our own intimate spaces and change our communities in front of us, change the church in front of us, or try to challenge the parish from wherever we are. So I think a lot of that is already happening. And again, it's a lot of grassroots work that is not uplifted, but I think that a lot of that work is happening and can continue to happen in spaces like these, where we imagine and think about what it means to build outside of institutions, especially because when we talk about decolonizing our church and building outside of the whiteness of our church, that's going to, if we are authentically trying to do that, then we're talking about radical changes to our church that we might not even be ready to name in 2022, but that people are trying to imagine in these smaller grassroots spaces. So I think that is how we are starting to see people figure out how to dismantle the institutional church. I think a lot of people are fed up and are saying, hey, I'm done with the institutional church and I'm just going to figure out what it means to be church now and respond to the signs of the times now. So I think that there are already a lot of spaces that are figuring out what it means to decolonize, what it means to dismantle the patriarchal Catholic power.
Thanks. Jim, there was a woman that said that she was a white ally, and she referred to looking at the history. How do we approach the history?
Yeah.
You see that?
Yeah. I'm a white ally and would like as many white people to hear and sit with the unjust history of our country. However, I wonder why the phrase white supremacy as opposed to white privilege was used for this talk. It's correct, but I wonder if this prevents white people from listening to what you have to say.
Thank you. I mean, for me, I use the term white supremacy because my life and the life of so many other marginalized Catholics of color demands it. We are living and experiencing daily violence that is at the root of, that is caused by white supremacy. So my lived experience and the experiences of my communities and all other marginalized folks in our church require that I name it white supremacy, because that's what it is. When your life is threatened by forces and communities that don't look like yours, that is white supremacy to me. But I will acknowledge that question, there absolutely is a tension in this. And I think that white allies, again, sitting with that history will help people feel less uncomfortable with terms like white supremacy, because when you sit with that history, there is no other way to call it than if you sit with the history of colonizers, white colonizers coming from Europe to indigenous lands and violently pillaging those lands. That is white supremacy. That is white supremacist violence that was at the start of this founding of this country, and that is white supremacist violence that has continued to shape every institution in this country, and white supremacist violence has allowed white bodies to have white privilege. So those two things are extremely connected. And I think that sitting with that history will help white allies understand why it is critical to use terms like white supremacy over white privilege, because it's also not about the comfort of white allies. That's also a reality that a lot of white allies have to sit with, right? It's not about what's going to make you feel comfortable, because this isn't supposed to make you feel comfortable. People are dying, people are in cages, people are forced to leave their homes and are being separated from their families. There's no other word for that but white supremacist violence. And sitting with that history will require white allies to acknowledge that and to say, like, hey, this is really, really messed up, and this is really messed up, and I have also benefited from this. And it is okay to acknowledge that and name that, because if we don't name the sins for what they are, how are we going to get better? And so for me, it is important for me to name white supremacy in the work that I do.
Gwen, I'm going to get to you next, but there was one, Jim, about being uncomfortable with Black and brown Catholic, the terminology. Do you see that one?
I do. I feel awkward and not comfortable with the term Black Catholics, brown, etc. Why can't we just say Catholics? Do we not make such situations increased by naming categories of Catholics?
I get this question every once in a while. And again, this ties into the answer that I just gave before this one. We are talking about violence that has been caused in this country historically by a very specific demographic of the American population. And we need to be able to name that. And we need to be able to name that the people who privilege from any kind of power in this country are white folks. We're talking about from our government to big tech to the military. These are all to our church. Every institutional power is predominantly white. So for us to pretend that to not name these things are going to make this better, it's not going to, because we have historically not been naming things as a country, as a church, as an educational system, whatever you might want to call it. We have not named these things. And so we need to, again, push past that discomfort, because Black Catholics, brown Catholics, Indigenous Catholics, every marginalized group, we need to recognize the differences, and we need to recognize, we mentioned intersectionality earlier, right? We cannot ignore the fact that a brown Catholic person, a Black Catholic person in the church has a very different lived reality from a white Catholic person. And we need to be able to name that in order for us to get to the point and to build the church where, yes, we ultimately want to build a society and a church where these labels don't matter, but we are not there yet. And until we fix that, again, the white supremacist violence, the inequity in this country, we have to be able to name this. We cannot just refuse to name the parts of people's identity, because a refusal to name these parts of our identities, a refusal to uplift these parts of our identities, is also how white supremacy has been perpetuated in our church and in this country. So again, it might be uncomfortable to acknowledge this and to use those terms, but we need to use those terms because we need to acknowledge people's lived realities.
Thank you. Gwen, you're on. Unmute yourself.
You're still muted.
I see. I'm okay now. Thank you.
There you go.
I was saying that you answered a lot of the things that having to do with this question, beginning with Betty's question. And you talked about gaslighting and so forth. One of the other things you hear a lot is, well, I'm not my ancestors. I didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And you explained that, but the most important thing you said was the history. Mm-hmm. I saw in the chat someone said that the history, depending on who's writing the history can be different, but the history is the history. The truth is the truth. Mm-hmm. And when we look at who wrote the history, and the reality of people who live that history,
Mhm.
be it that they recorded it in orally or not,
Mhm.
it's real. It's
Mhm.
real.
Mhm.
And to ignore that,
Mhm.
and that also goes back to this last question about why we have to identify ourselves, but we do have to identify ourselves
Mhm.
because we're seen that way. As you talked about intersectionality, that's when someone sees me, the first thing they see is my Blackness.
Mhm. Mhm.
Then they see my womanness.
Mhm.
But that's that, and so they first treat me as a Black person and then
Mhm.
as a woman, as a
Mhm.
Black woman.
Mhm.
So it can't be ignored. It
Mhm.
can't be ignored. And when
Mhm.
we go around saying, oh, everybody's the same, well, everyone isn't the same because
Mhm.
our experiences aren't the same. Our lives aren't our lived experiences aren't the same. And what we have to go through is not the same.
Mhm.
So you touched on all of that, and I couldn't have said it better myself. But that gaslighting thing is real. It's
Mhm.
really real. And learning our history is on both sides. We need to learn our history so we could better combat that gaslighting.
Mhm.
And um, the other side needs to know the history so they can stop it. So,
Mhm.
stop
Mhm.
doing
Mhm.
it. So
Mhm.
that's all I wanted to respond to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. Because you're absolutely right. Both sides have to sit with the history too. Especially one thing that I have found myself returning to, especially after I wrote my first book and after I was in that very, very dark place where I was like, man, this just feels like there's just so many awful things around me. Like, how am I going to overcome this? And then I had to take a step back and say, wait a minute, your ancestors have overcome many things that were a lot more threatening and violent than what you are experiencing today. And sitting with that history, sitting with the history of how liberation has manifested itself throughout history and how Black women in particular have revolted in moments of severe oppression and violence. That history, sitting with that ancestral history, is also where this idea of resilient hope can be built for not just our communities, but also for white allies too, right? Because we need to be able to say, hey, there are these really awful and ugly parts of our history that have happened and that continue to shape the world that we see today, right? Including the gaslighting that we get from white Catholic men and women in our particular spaces. But at the same time, that history was also accompanied by amazing examples of Black and Indigenous Americans in particular who are like, hey, I'm not going to stop fighting for liberation, and I'm not going to stop fighting for a world where people are free, even if it meant losing my own life. And being able to sit with that history, being able to sit with examples of people who are literally embodying Christ on the cross, right? People who have literally placed their lives on the line for marginalized people. That history is so, so important and so profound. And it reminds us that it pulls us away from, at least for me, it pulls me away from the individualism that can be very easy to fall down in the United States. It can be very easy for me to say, oh my God, I cannot think outside of my experience. I cannot think outside of the suffering that me and my community and my family are experiencing. And being able to sit with that history reminds me, oh wait, it's not just about you, it's about your community, it's about building power. And look at these amazing examples of how people have built that power. So thank you for that, Gwendolyn.
I have a question. If this group were part of the parish or group that that you were involved with on a regular basis, I'll speak for myself. White hair, and you are younger, white. But what would a couple of things be that would be very supportive of you, that you would know that these folks are in your corner?
Thank you, Jim. I think that's a really important question. And I think it's important for white allies in particular to be asking too, like, what does it mean to support Black and brown folks immediately? So I think a lot of that, one, I keep returning to this idea of history, which you guys are already doing, right? Hosting events where people can have these types of conversations. I think prayer is also instrumental. I know a lot of people I see a lot of millennials who are, I have a lot of millennials in my life who are very much like prayers, prayers are not the only thing we want action. But I do think that that spiritual support is also extremely, extremely important. Knowing that these communities are praying for grassroots organizers in particular is extremely important. And also releasing this kind of might seem non-consequential, so to speak, for a lot of folks. But I think even releasing statements when major moments happen in the news, for example, like when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, and we were hearing all this news about the African migrants who were stranded there and who could not leave and who were being treated very differently. I think for me, it's always encouraging to see these various groups who are thinking about anti-racism work in the United States and who are commenting on what is happening at the border, who are people who are thinking about what's happening in particular with Haitians at the border, seeing folks who are publicly saying like, hey, what we see happening at the border with Haiti is directly related to what we're seeing happening to African migrants in Ukraine. And being able to see white Catholics in particular publicly connect those dots while also contextualizing the history that we have gotten into a little bit today, that to me is an immediate sign of support. Whenever I see people trying to challenge Catholics to think about the oppression of Black and brown bodies in the United States and connect that to the oppression of Black and brown bodies all around the world, to me, that is a huge symbol of support. And it shows people that you are doing a lot of the work that we have already named throughout this conversation. And last, I think figuring out how to support organizers, figuring out how to fundraise and support organizers who might be doing grassroots work in Pittsburgh, trying to figure out what resources they might need, or if they need a book drive, right? Just getting creative with what it means to financially also support people who are doing a lot of the unpaid work. Because I think the reality is a lot of people also might not feel comfortable going to marches and protesting publicly outside, but figuring out how to support the people who are doing that work every day, right? Because there are always organizers who are protesting and who are fighting for something, whether that's in New York, whether that's at the border, whether that's all over the world. So I think though that is another way to figure out how to help people. So I think those are a few ways that whenever I see people doing that, I think, oh, okay, they're thinking about how to help in the short term. And of course, also dreaming and imagining how to support long-term too, right? I like to have dream projects where in my mind, if I had all the resources in the world, I'd have acres on a farm where I would have a retreat center where I can support writers who can be in that space, and it would be a sort of spiritual retreat. And I think allowing spaces like this to dream about what the possibilities could be if resources weren't an option, I think those two things are part of what it means to do this allyship liberatory work.
We're actually a little bit past the time. However, just one more. Somebody wanted to know the definition of gaslighting. And then I'm going to say that let's preserve all the other things in the chat. We'll communicate with you, Olga, and then we'll get your responses. Then we can get back to people, okay? But gaslighting, people wanted to know, what does that mean?
Oh, yeah. So again, not the very official definition of it, but gaslighting is just when someone is in a space with another person and they try to manipulate someone, whether that's through psychological means, emotional means, into questioning their own sanity or their own experience. So as Gwendolyn and Betty, who we sort of got into and we discussed it, it means someone, for example, approaching you and saying, hey, I experienced this instance of misogyny, or I experienced this instant of racism, and here's how I felt, and here is what happened. And when someone meets that type of a situation by saying, oh no, that didn't happen, or I think you took it out of context, or I think you're being a little sensitive, or I think, your generation is just a little too PC. Those are examples of gaslighting, when you make someone doubt a very real reality that has happened to them. And that is so much more common than you realize. When I talk about the anxiety and the mental stresses of being in white Catholic spaces, gaslighting is one of the things that is so normalized and so common, and is one of the most devastating things that happen in these spaces. So that's what it is when you try to emotionally manipulate someone into not believing what they know that they for a fact have experienced.
Thanks so much. We're just going to give you an opportunity, Olga, just to wrap this up. And if you have a closing remark of this whole experience for you and for us.
Yeah, totally. So thank you again for giving me another opportunity to offer some last minute remarks. I'm so grateful for the questions that I got today and for you guys to give me the space to think through what abolition, Catholicism, what liberation can mean at this moment. And so before I leave, I just want to leave with these parting words, or not before I leave, but to my closing remarks, I want to leave with this. These are from a poem called Salt by Nayyirah Waheed. And I return to it a lot, especially when I'm thinking about what it means to decolonize my faith and to think outside of the whiteness of Catholicism. And it goes, decolonization requires acknowledging that your needs and desires should never come at the expense of another's life energy. It is being honest that you have been spoiled by a machine that is not feeding you freedom, but feeding you the milk of pain. Thank you.
Thank you so much.